So as we continue our consideration of the disability categories, one of the diagnoses that we work with a lot in schools is ADHD. ADHD doesn't have a specific category within the public law IDEA, but it is a concern that many students face and that we as teachers need to be able to respond to. The ADHD community continues to advocate to lawmakers that they should have their own category in special education, but very often these students are served under the disability category OHI, or other health impairment. We'll talk about OHI a little bit later on, but this is where most students with ADHD are being served. Congress has continued to say to these disability advocates that we don't need to create a separate category for students with ADHD because those kids are getting services, and we're not using a label called ADHD. And we know that in special education, when we classify a student and give them a label, there's stigma that comes with that, negative stigma, and in some places life-altering stigma. And so Congress's attitude has been, why create this extra stigma when those kids are already receiving services? So that's just a little bit of the history of the legal perspective related to ADHD. In terms of the definition of ADHD, when I was in school, you had ADHD or you had ADD. ADD was attention deficit disorder. ADHD was attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And the student with ADD was primarily inattentive. They seemed like they weren't paying attention in class and they were disengaged. Whereas ADHD is what sort of society and media has portrayed as that kid that can't focus, that's bouncing off the walls, that's up and out of their seats all of the time. And so for a long time we saw those as two different things. Today the medical community views ADHD, so it's the same term as one of the old categories, but now it's used as an umbrella term. And so any student that would have either primary inattentive or primarily hyperactive traits would be labeled under that AD/HD. And so there's three sort of subtypes: one, primarily inattentive; two, primarily hyperactive; and three, a combined. And the vast majority of students with ADHD fall under that combined type. They manifest both that level of inattentiveness and the hyperactivity. So that's a little bit of the history of the term, both from the medical perspective and the legal perspective. One thing that's incredibly important for us as teachers, and so I think most teachers who have been trained to have a teaching license or to be professionalized to teach, we're not medical doctors. We don't have, MD after our names. And so it's critical that we never say to a parent, I think your child has ADHD. We're not qualified to make that determination, and it's professionally inappropriate to do so. The backlash of this is that as teachers, even though we're not medically qualified, what we say to parents has a professional weight to it. We'll talk a little bit more about the overdiagnosis of ADHD and the overmedication of ADHD. And when we as teachers suggest that a student has ADHD, we contribute to those two causes. Because if a parent goes to a doctor, a general practitioner, with the statement at school, they said my child has ADHD, doctors can be really quick to go ahead and make that diagnosis and medicate. We overdiagnose ADHD, and therefore we overmedicate ADHD. The schedule of medicines that are used for ADHD are primarily stimulant medicines. I know that comes across as a little counterintuitive. Why would we take a child who has a hard time focusing and giving them a stimulant? But for the true ADHD brain, that stimulant actually allows them to calm down and to engage. And every teacher who's ever worked with a student with ADHD, we can set our watches by when those medications wear off, especially in a time before extended release medication. So it's really important not to make that claim to parents. Now you may ask, if you have a student who you're concerned that may have some issues related to hyperactivity or their ability to maintain attention in class, how do you bring that up to parents? And I think the best conversation to have is one that's supported by data. And so if what we're concerned about is the student's inability to have attention to the curriculum, we need to take some frequency and duration data. So how frequently is that student off task, and how long is that off task behavior happening? And then compare that data to an average student or your student population as a whole. So for example, and I'm just making these numbers up, if we have a student who we're concerned about who's off tasks, say 10 times a day, and every time that they're off task, it takes them 3 to 5 minutes to get back onto task, then we're talking about a loss of instructional time that's somewhere between a half an hour and a full hour. Whereas a typical student may be off task, 5 or 6 or 7 times, yet they're able to get back to task in, say, 15 or 30 seconds. And so it's that kind of comparative information that we would provide to parents in that conversation related to the concern. If parents ask, what do you think we should do with this information? My suggestion is always to have them talk to their doctor and to go in with these are the concerns, not my teacher said that my child has ADHD. I find it really handy as a special ed teacher to pay attention to which doctors in the community do a good job of diagnosing ADHD, which ones are using an inventory that they're sending out to teachers and other people in the child's life. One thing that we know about ADHD and its diagnosis is that the behavior has to exist in multiple environments, so not just at school. Because if a child's just not attentive at school, perhaps there's some other issue. Perhaps they're just bored and they're finding other things to do that aren't related to the task at hand. But if they have that behavior at school, at home, at church, in extracurricular activities, then we would look at that issue. And so that means that teachers and parents and coaches and sponsors of other activities should have or provide feedback to the doctor so that they can see if this behavior is prevalent across different domains of the child's life. And so I always like to know within my community which doctors are using those scales versus which ones are just pulling out the prescription pad. And so if a parent ever asks me, who do you think we should talk to about this, I would give them a list of those doctors. Always at least 3. I don't feel ethically I'm in the position to make specific recommendations, but I do have a list of the doctors that I really trust within my own community to provide to parents. So those are some considerations about ADHD, a little bit of the history and the legal policy behind ADHD, how the medical community views ADHD, and then ways to have some conversations with parents if we're concerned about a child's attention to the academic curriculum at school.